June 1944. In the French village of Villers-Bocage, the ground shook under the weight of the Tiger 07. The German officers watched confidently. To them, that armored colossus represented the epitome of German technical superiority, a single tank capable of taking on dozens. General Heinz Guderian had said years earlier, "With the Tiger, the battlefield will be ours." He believed. Germany believed. But that belief was about to be crushed, not by a stronger enemy, but by a more numerous enemy. A force that did not seek glory or elegance, just efficiency. On the other side of the channel, American assembly lines rotated incessantly, and what they produced wasn't just steel, it was a concept. The concept that enough repeated thousands of times can defeat perfect alone. This documentary will reveal the clash between two worlds. One relied on the genius concentrated in 1,247 copies. The other bet on the brutal repetition of 49.234. Let's see how Tiger became a symbol and Sherman system. Because in the end, the war was not decided by a duel of titans. It was decided by the doctrine that he knew how to tell. And he told until the end. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story, and it's not in the playbooks, but on the production lines. While Germany delivered 347 examples of the most feared tank of the war to the battlefield, the United States launched 49,234 steel machines that were never meant to be feared, only to work. It was not a duel, it was a flood. A Tiger faced 5, 10, 20 Shermans. Most impressively, Americans could lose them all and replace them within weeks. The genius of the Tiger was real, but what stood up against him was more than a machine. It was a concept. If you value the story told with depth, accuracy, and respect for the facts, consider leaving your like and subscribing to the channel. This keeps the memory alive and helps reveal what really decided the war. In 1941, in the icy steppes of the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht encountered something it had not expected, the T-34. Simple, fast, with sloped armor and a mobility capability that defied German logic, the Soviet tank was everything the Nazi generals had underestimated. And this surprise gave rise to a monster. The German High Command ordered the urgent development of a new vehicle, a colossus that would restore the Reich's technical superiority. That was the birth of the project that would give rise to the Panzerkampfwagen 6, the Tiger. For Henschel's engineers, the Tiger was not just a tank. It was a philosophical answer, an artifact that embodied the German ideal that pure quality, if taken to the extreme, could overwhelm any number. The result was impressive: 57 tons of steel frontal armor that no Allied cannon could pass through, an 80mm gun derived from anti-aircraft artillery with surgical precision at more than 2 kilometers. The first test confirmed the myth. It only took one shot to destroy a Sherman. The minimum distance to pierce a Tiger, on the other hand, was practically suicidal. German doctrine soon molded itself around the new machine. The Tiger was supposed to operate as a lone predator, ambushing, terrorizing, destroying. War, for German officers, would once again be an art of precision. But while Germany was designing the perfect tank, the United States was designing a system. By 1942, as the Germans struggled to complete the first prototypes of the Tiger, American factories were already producing nearly 1,000 tanks a month. And it wasn't about art, it was about repetition. Each Sherman was designed to be built with simple materials, by workers without military specialization, on industrial lines that until weeks before manufactured civilian cars. The Germans saw this as primitive, but they ignored a brutal truth. What cannot be mass-produced cannot be sustained in war. The Tiger took up to 300,000 man-hours to produce. The Sherman, less than 10,000. The equation was clear, but Germany insisted on beating it by exception. By September 1943, the High Command estimated that the Tiger would have a disproportionate impact on the field, and, in fact, in isolated confrontations, it wreaked havoc. In battles such as Kursk and Leningrad, there were Shermans and T-34s decimated without the Tigers suffering scratches, but these clashes were tactical victories, and the war required strategic solutions. The German technical obsession did not allow shortcuts. Each Tiger was assembled by hand. The armor was too thick for any adaptation in the field. The Maybach engine consumed absurd amounts of fuel and broke down frequently. The suspension required bespoke parts. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was interchangeable. A failure in the pin of a caterpillar could render the machine unusable for days. Now pause. In 1944, while Germany produced 63 Tigers that month, the United States fielded 2,400 Shermans, nearly 40 times as many. That's the statistic they ignored. If this number impresses you, comment now. Logistics wins, because what was to come would be even more devastating. The Tiger's aura persisted. It was feared, legendary, whispered on Allied radios as an inevitable appearance. But it was scarce, fragile outside the ideal, untransportable without special trains, unable to maneuver on ordinary bridges. When it got stuck, it needed 2 other Tigers to be towed, something unthinkable on the field. And the most symbolic, his own perfection, made him irreplaceable. There was no reservation, there was no network. When a Tiger exploded, Germany lost more than a tank. It wasted time, engineering, morale. In contrast, the Allies viewed each Sherman lost as a number within a predicted statistical curve. It wasn't sloppiness, it was calculation. The Tiger made an impact, but the impact, isolated, does not sustain a front of 1,000 kilometers, and even the German generals began to notice. In 1944, an internal Wehrmacht report warned, "Production does not keep up with losses. We need standardized solutions. The enemy overcomes us by multiplication." But it was too late. The German colossus could no longer change, and Detroit was nowhere near stopping. In the next chapter, what seemed impossible begins to reveal itself in numbers that no German cannon could stop, not even the 80mm one. Because, while the Tigers roared, the American trains moved forward with the repetitive sound of inevitability. The Tiger wasn't just a tank, it was a moving sculpture. Each unit required very high-quality steel, hand-assembled Maybach engines, wheels interleaved with millimeter precision, and transmission systems that required constant technical adjustment. The frontal armor, up to 120mm, was not simply welded. It was molded, heat-treated, fitted to aviation-worthy engineering tolerances. To build a single Tiger, more than 300,000 hours of human labor were required. This was equivalent to the effort of hundreds of specialized workers for months to produce a single copy. And each copy had to work perfectly because there was no margin for error, no possibility of serial production. While the United States manufactured tanks on standardized industrial tracks with interchangeable parts and optimized methods, Germany still used almost artisanal processes. The Tiger was mounted like a Swiss watch, and that was the problem. A tank that requires watch maintenance does not survive the mud of Normandy. With each advance, pieces broke. With each confrontation, gears locked. There was no scale, there was no replacement network. The shortage was structural. The Germans didn't just suffer from the destruction of the Tiger in combat. They suffered from the impossibility of repairing it. The train carrying the parts was bombed. The factory ran out of steel. The necessary engineer was dead. Everything was fragile. In contrast, the Allies could replace a destroyed Sherman before they could even report the loss. Parts were shipped by cargo ships, trucks, airplanes, a complete system in motion. American logistics foresaw failures, and the solution was already born. German logistics did not foresee failures, and so it collapsed at the slightest impact. The irony is clear. The obsession with technical excellence has resulted in a product that is impossible to sustain. A report from the Castle factory, dated October 1943, admitted that any interruption in the supply line could jeopardize the shipment of dozens of units, and the interruptions were constant. Meanwhile, the American lines operated in 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Civilian workers, many of them women, rode Shermans as if they were tractors, and in a way, they were. The simplicity was intentional. Each Sherman screw could be replaced with common tools. Every engine, every suspension, every track could be swapped out for models of other versions. The American tank wasn't a piece of art, it was a spare piece in itself. American engineers understood early on, modern warfare does not reward those who build best. It rewards those who build anew. And the Tiger couldn't be remade with speed. The cost per unit was 10 times higher. The delivery time was 6 times longer, and the pain of losing it 20 times deeper. It was like losing a general with each explosion. The Wehrmacht soon felt this weight. Elite troops were assigned to protect Tiger units. Entire trains were diverted to take them to the front. Fuel was rationed to keep them operational, and even so, dozens of them were abandoned without even having fired. Not for lack of courage, but for lack of parts, due to lack of infrastructure. For lack of a doctrine that understood that war does not forgive the rare. By 1944, with the Allied offensive in full swing, only 300 Tigers were active on the entire Western Front. In contrast, the Allies would land more than 2,000 Shermans in Normandy alone in a month. The scale was no longer just numerical, it was structural. The Tiger had become an anchor, a symbol of what could no longer be sustained, and the symbol, once discredited, becomes a burden. In the next chapter, the numbers cease to be projections and become evidence in the field, because the war will soon be fought between isolated genius and functionality repeated to exhaustion. While Germany was still assembling its Tigers with skilled labor, under muffled noises and heavy machinery, in factories vulnerable to bombing, something colossal was already in motion on the other side of the Atlantic. In the heart of the United States, Detroit was no longer just the city of automobiles. It became the greatest hotbed of war that modern history had ever witnessed. There was no obsession with perfect tanks. There was an obsession with numbers. General Motors, Chrysler, Ford, all the civilian giants were called into an unprecedented war effort. In a matter of months, factories that once produced pickup trucks now assembled armored vehicles. Car engines gave way to combat engines. The assembly line was not adapted. It was expanded, multiplied, synchronized. The M4 Sherman tank was born from this industrial doctrine. Every bolt, every steel plate, every inch of pipe was standardized. The concept of bespoke piece was abolished. All parts fit all tanks. This allowed for serial production at a speed unattainable by European standards. A Sherman could be assembled in less than 40 days, with civilian workers trained in a few months, using machines already existing in the automotive sector. Instead of protecting one tank as a relic, Americans chose to build thousands and prepared the world for those thousands to function as one body. There was no exclusivity, there was scale. By 1942, the United States was already producing more tanks per month than Germany was producing in a half year, and every month this number grew. But the secret was not only in the factories, it was in philosophy. The M4 Sherman was designed to be transportable by rail, light enough to cross rickety bridges, simple enough to be operated by 19-year-olds with only a few weeks of training. It was designed to break and come back, to be damaged and repaired with parts taken from another Sherman. The manuals predicted failures and taught how to solve them with basic tools. This was not technical inferiority, it was doctrinal superiority. It was war understood as a system, not as a duel. The Germans viewed this philosophy with contempt. A 1943 Panzerwaffe report describes the Sherman as a pragmatic, limited-value solution in direct combat against heavy armor. It was true, but it was also a strategic blindness. Because the Shermans didn't face the Tigers on an equal footing, they faced in numbers, in a network, in synchrony. For every Tiger destroyed, 3 Shermans were lost. But while the Tiger couldn't be replaced, the Shermans came in the thousands. By 1944, Americans had enough reserves to replace losses before they even suffered them. Ocean convoys transported tanks in droves with inventory planning, maintenance, and supply. The Sherman wasn't just a tank. It was a product with global distribution. From the African desert to the forests of Belgium, it arrived, operated, and, if necessary, was abandoned, because there was already another on the way. This logic was the basis of American supremacy. Strategists did not wonder how many tanks would win a battle. They asked how many tanks they could lose until victory was inevitable. And the answer was always reassuring. Detroit could handle it. The arsenal of democracy was not just a political metaphor. It was a mechanical reality, and it smashed concepts like absolute quality with the brute force of intelligent standardization. By January 1944, American monthly production of Shermans exceeded 2,000 units. The German, adding all types of tanks, did not reach 500. The balance no longer existed. The battlefield began before the trench. It started on the crane, on the conveyor belt, on the cargo ship. It began in the calculated silence of American factories, where each weld was more strategic than any speech. And behind every Sherman delivered, there was an invisible doctrine, that war is not won with the most sophisticated weapon, but with the weapon that never stops coming. In the next chapter, we'll look at what happened when these tanks found flaws and how the Americans turned even their own mistakes into operational advantage. Because sometimes winning is not avoiding failure, it is knowing how to correct it before the enemy notices. The actual battlefield began when the engine failed. It was there that the difference between a machine and a system became evident. A stationary Tiger wasn't just a broken armored vehicle, it was a colossus without help. For each breakdown, it required specific cranes, tailor-made parts, highly trained mechanics, and a recovery time that often made its return to combat unfeasible. If the defect occurred far from the supply line, the fate was almost always the same: abandonment. German officers reported that in certain offensives, as many as half of the Tigers lost had never been hit by enemy fire. They stopped due to overheating, broken transmission, or failure of the tracks, and there was simply no way to rescue them under pressure. Field maintenance became a nightmare. Every bolt was unique. Every access to the engine required disassembly. The tank was literally too big to fall, and so it fell on its own. In contrast, Sherman didn't just allow failures, he absorbed them. A broken power cable, replaced with the tank part on the side. A broken treadmill. It was cut, improvised, moved on. American standardization allowed for something unthinkable for the Germans. A field team could disassemble a damaged Sherman in the morning and reassemble it in the afternoon, with parts from 2 or 3 different tanks. The doctrine did not depend on excellence. It depended on feedback, and what returned to combat was more valuable than what was waiting for glory. In certain Allied armored divisions, there were mobile recovery teams that followed the tanks like shadows. When a Sherman was hit, it was already calculated whether it was worth repairing or replacing it, and both options were always within reach. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them, but Germany chose to build machines that could not break, until they all did. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support, like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. Because this is not just a war report, it is a portrait of choices, and the choices made in the workshop weighed more than those made in the field. The greatest proof of this would come in 1944, when German forces discovered that they were no longer facing tanks. They faced swarms. And the next installment will show how this American philosophy was translated into tactics and how it crushed, with numbers and mobility, what the Reich believed to be invincible. Germany believed that war was won by predators. The Panzer Doctrine, forged in the lightning victories of Poland and France, still echoed in the Wehrmacht manuals. Tanks operated like lone hunters. They ambushed, destroyed, and retreated. The Tiger is designed for exactly that, to eliminate the enemy before it is even detected. With its 80mm gun and nearly impenetrable armor, it was supposed to choose the field, dominate the position, and command respect. But the war had changed, and the Americans weren't interested in duels. They were interested in advancement. The U.S. Army adopted a diametrically opposed doctrine. War as an integrated system. No Sherman operated alone. Each platoon was composed of multiple tanks, accompanied by motorized infantry, air cover, and mobile artillery units. Radio communication was standardized. The advance was coordinated. And when a Sherman fell, the space he left was already covered by another. The Tiger, as impressive as it was, had a human and material limit. It was slow, overfueled, and required an extremely experienced crew. The Americans, on the other hand, trained their soldiers to operate as a team, focusing on the mission rather than technical heroism. Battles were no longer decided by the best shooter, but by the group that moved best together. And the Shermans knew how to move. In head-to-head confrontations, yes, a Tiger could destroy several Shermans before being hit. But Americans quickly caught on to the pattern. Instead of facing them head-on, they surrounded them. Instead of attacking them alone, they suffocated in numbers. Planes were hunting Tigers before they even reached the line of fire. Artillery marked known positions. German ambushes worked in the early hours. Then came the waves. The U.S. Army applied a cumulative logic. If the former did not win, the latter weakened. The third flanked. The room would fall down. And the fifth was already aiming for the next target. The Tiger had no answer for continuity. German doctrine prepared soldiers to protect a symbol, not to sustain an ongoing offensive. In contrast, American doctrine trained soldiers to operate under the certainty that there would always be another platoon, another tank, another plane supporting the advance. It was war transformed into a flux, not a duel. In 1944, during Operation Cobra, the difference became evident. The Germans prepared defensive positions with Panthers and Tigers on high ground, hoping to destroy the first wave of Allied tanks, and they succeeded. But they were unprepared for what came next. 1,800 Shermans crossing open fields, flanked by P-47 fighter bombers, supported by mechanized infantry and with radios in direct contact with Central Command. The German front simply collapsed, not because of the quality of the tanks, but because of the speed of decisions. While Germany formed tactics around the exception, the United States built strategies based on repetition. The difference was doctrinal, she was philosophical. The Germans were stuck with the idea that the perfect machine would win. The Americans understood that the adaptive machine would survive, and by surviving, he would win. This mentality meant that every mistake on the field was corrected within weeks. If the Sherman needed extra armor, a new version emerged. If the cannon was weak, a new one was adapted. The Tiger remained static, the Sherman was evolving in gear. In the next chapter, we'll look at how this doctrine of mobility, coupled with air dominance, turned the battlefield into a terrain where the Tiger was no longer the hunter, and she began to be the prey. From 1944 onwards, the war in Western Europe was decided by something quieter than a cannon shot. It was decided by numbers. Germany, even with all its tactical experience, could not calculate what was coming. The industrial arithmetic of the United States had become a weapon in itself. For every Tiger deployed in combat, the Allies could mobilize from 5 to 20 Shermans. This disproportion, once theoretical, became visible and suffocating on the plains of France. A single tiger, upon spotting an enemy column, no longer saw a target, he saw a swarm. It could destroy 3, 4, maybe 5 Shermans before it was hit. But those behind were not there for the duel. They were there to replace, to superimpose, to crush for presence. The statistics left no room for maneuver. For each tiger destroyed, Germany lost not only the vehicle, but months of work, tons of material, and an irreplaceable crew. The United States, on the other hand, replaced theirs in days. U.S. Logistics convoys were so constant that there were documented cases where divisions received new tanks even before losing old ones. American production wasn't just a line, it was a river, and this river did not stop flowing. On the field, this translated into painful decisions for the Germans. Officers were forced to abandon defensible positions to save their tigers from capture for lack of support or fuel. On many occasions, the soldiers themselves placed explosive charges on their intact tigers to prevent them from falling into Allied hands. The most feared machine of war was now left behind, not because it had been defeated in direct combat, but because it had been suffocated in numbers. Allied radios knew this. Tactics evolved. P-47 Thunderbolt planes, specialized in armored fighters, began to track areas where tigers might be hiding. American reports indicated that in certain regions, the mere sound of air engines already made German crews abandon their tanks. It was the collapse of doctrine by the weight of saturation. While the Germans struggled to deliver dozens, the Americans delivered thousands. In June 1944 alone, during the first 30 days of the Normandy campaign, the United States landed 1,500 Shermans. By comparison, the total production of Tigers for the whole of 1943 was no more than 700 units. The proportion grew every month, like a living statistic imposing itself on European soil. There was no doctrine that could support it. There was no general who compensated, and perhaps more symbolically, there was no tiger who could resist the inevitability of repetition. German tanks, created as individual masterpieces, were consumed as unique pieces in a game that no longer accepted exceptions. Modern warfare required ruthless mathematics, and that math was on the American side. In the next chapter, we'll dive into the testimonies of the crews, those inside those tanks, those who saw the numbers come true, and those who, even as they fought valiantly, understood that the battlefield had been moved from the front line to the assembly line. For the Wehrmacht soldiers assigned to the Tigers, the feeling was divided between glory and sentence. Being chosen to man Germany's most advanced tank was a symbol of prestige, but also a silent premonition. The Tiger was admired inside and feared outside. Its interior, tight, metallic and warm, worked as a capsule of technical confidence and emotional isolation. The accounts of the veterans reveal this contrast. Many describe feeling invulnerable when firing the 88mm gun and watching enemy tanks destroy from a distance. But that feeling came with a price. All sides knew that a Tiger in the field was a priority target. The Allies trained entire platoons exclusively to hunt down these vehicles. Planes with armor-piercing ammunition, infantry with bazookas, artillery with specific coordinates. Each Tiger attracted a swarm of destruction proportional to its myth. The crew knew that, unlike a Sherman, if they were hit, there would be no other waiting for them in the rear. They were rare resources, trained for months, and with very low chances of replacement. A Tiger commander who survived a mission was often kept in the field even exhausted, because there was no replacement. The pressure was psychological. They knew that any breakdown, jam, or miscommunication would leave them surrounded. In several accounts, veterans recall the dread of being captured inside a burning hull with no time for evacuation. And the doctrine of the perfect machine offered little consolation. There was no margin for error, no tolerance for human attrition. It was win or burn. By comparison, Sherman's crew members faced another kind of risk. but also a different mindset. They knew they were part of something bigger. They knew that if they fell, there would be others. It was a war that was less individualistic, more systemic, and that changed everything. A little remembered but revealing fact: the average life expectancy of a Sherman crew in direct combat was only 6 days, but by the end of the war, most had been replaced at least once. The Tiger's men, on the other hand, fought knowing that their lives were tied to the life of the tank itself. If he died, they died. If they survived, they would be kept at the front, an equation with no way out. Now take a moment and consider this. American production of Sherman tanks outnumbered German by more than 35 times. If this statistic surprised you, comment below with the phrase "absolute power," because that was the real force surrounding the Tigers. It wasn't armor, it was statistics. By the end of 1944, German officials knew that it was no longer possible to balance the losses. The technical elite had become a logistical whole, and the crew an asset that could no longer be replaced. In the next chapter, we'll follow the fate of the Tigers in the frozen fields of the Battle of the Bulge, where even the most perfect tanks were defeated not by direct fire, but by cold, lack of fuel, and the unforgiving reality of a war that was no longer won in the barrel of the gun. Long before the first shot was fired in Normandy, the United States had already projected its victory, not on battle maps, but on industrial plants. War, for American strategists, would not be decided by brilliant maneuvers or impeccable machines. It would be overcome as a bridge is built, with planning, redundancy, and structure. When war broke out, the U.S. government didn't just mobilize factories. It redesigned the economy itself. The War Production Office established weekly goals, predefined contracts, logistical routes, and material flows that linked each point in the U.S. territory to a clear objective: to keep the fighting going. The M4 Sherman was born from this logic. Each unit was produced with the same mindset as a piece of farming, something that any worker could understand, assemble, and if necessary, repair with ordinary tools. It wasn't the best tank in the world, but it was the most feasible. And this viability is what made it unbeatable. Military manuals already provided for wear and tear. The failures were not exceptions, they were components of doctrine. While Germany tried to protect its models with complexity, the United States replaced them with simplicity. Instead of creating a super machine, they created a superstructure. Behind each tank was a dedicated railroad, a parts depot, a maintenance unit, a coordinated supply line on scales that the Germans simply couldn't replicate. In many cases, American logistics delivered tanks even before the loss reports reached the high command. Communication was integrated, supply systems automated by punch cards and daily reports. There was no improvisation. There was a lawsuit. The Germans, pressured by a war on several fronts and by a leadership obsessed with miracle weapons, were forced to redirect factories, reinvent systems, adapt last-minute components. Each innovation was born of urgency, each solution of a crisis. In contrast, the United States had already assumed that it would lose tanks and prepared for it. The superiority was not technical, it was moral. It was the conscious choice to sacrifice the ideal in the name of the necessary. And in total war, what is necessary is what prevails. American doctrine treated production not as support, but as a weapon. The war was planned backwards. Even before landing in France, there were already manuals on how to operate and supply Shermans on European soil. Pre-assembled trucks were shipped with parts for specific situations. Mobile workshops crossed the channel with the first trains. Germany was still building tanks. The US was already building the next battle. The difference was not just in what each tank could do, but in how many, when, where, and how long they could be kept in action. An army does not survive on bravery alone. He survives on screws, barrels of oil, boxes of ammunition, and anonymous drivers who cross roads in the rain, taking parts to a vehicle they don't even know. And it was this invisible engineering that crushed the heroic vision of the perfect machine. By the end of 1944, the numbers spoke for themselves. The United States had produced more than 17,000 Shermans that year, nearly 50 a day. Germany, with all its combined efforts, had not even reached 6,000 tanks of all types. The scales no longer tilted. It had collapsed. And yet Hitler insisted on new projects. The next chapter will reveal the Third Reich's obsession with tanks that are ever bigger, heavier, more perfect, and more useless in the face of an enemy that sought not the best, but enough. In the books and in the propaganda, the Tiger was a titan of steel, but in the frozen fields of Europe, he was often nothing more than a monument to strategic hubris. From the fall of 1944, reports from the Western and Eastern fronts began to show a pattern that Germany refused to admit. Each Tiger lost was less a consequence of the fighting and more a product of the inability to keep it alive. In the Ardennes, in Kursk, in Normandy, hundreds were abandoned intact simply because they ran out of fuel, got stuck on muddy roads, or had mechanical failures before they were even put into gear. In many cases, prepared, experienced crews were forced to destroy their own tanks with internal explosives to prevent capture. The image of the armored colossus, ruthless and dominant, was replaced by the silent sight of smoking carcasses, with open hatches and debris scattered like vanquished statues. The operational slowness, the absurd consumption of resources, and the dependence on highly vulnerable logistical routes made the Tiger a prestige machine, but not an all-out war machine. Its 88mm gun rarely fired as often as needed. With each Allied advance, the number of Tigers left behind grew. An Allied field report described, during the offensive in France, the capture of 3 abandoned Tigers within a 5-kilometer radius, none of them damaged by direct fire. 2 were out of fuel, one had broken his suspension while trying to cross a stream. Heinz Guderian himself, architect of the German armored doctrine, admitted in 1945, "We created a machine that could only operate in a perfect world, and the battlefield is anything but." Maintaining a single Tiger required 3 times as long as a Panzer IV and nearly 5 times as long as a Sherman. The internal complexity, with hundreds of unique components, made any repair a task of surgical precision, but the fighting required haste. Result, what was thought to last simply could not come back. Meanwhile, the Americans continued to push forward with their Shermans, noticing their way, replacing without hesitation. In battles like Falaise's, dozens of Tigers were located still with internal ammunition and engines intact, but immobile, surrounded or bogged down. What should be the terror of the front in practice became the first to be left behind. The technical superiority, so exalted, did not find support in the face of the speed of events. In several documented confrontations, the Tiger did not even have time to engage. The convoy was spotted, attacked by aerial artillery, and forced to abandon the vehicles before the first shot. In many cases, they were ambushed before starting the engine. It was the collapse of a doctrine made for the testing ground, not the battlefield. In contrast, the Sherman didn't have to be the best. I just needed to arrive. And he arrived. One piece of data illustrates this difference in a brutal way. It is estimated that about 600 Tigers were lost to causes unrelated to direct combat, more than 40% of the total production. If this statistic is astonishing, it is because it reveals that Tiger's greatest enemy was not Sherman. It was his very existence. In the next chapter, we will cross the Atlantic again to find out how the United States, while watching the German operational collapse, was already producing the next generation of tanks, planes, and ships. Because for those who understand that war is engineering, victory is never the last chapter. It's the next project. Tanks don't win alone. Behind every mechanized advance in World War II, there was a second army, invisible, silent, but even more decisive, the army of logistics. And in this field, the United States has created a machine as powerful as its armored vehicles. The American victory was not built with steel alone, but with concrete, rails, marine engines, and rail maps. As Germany watched its trains explode on sabotage lines and its highways bombed relentlessly, the Allies responded with something new, a war ecosystem on the move. Upon landing in Normandy, American engineers didn't just build roads. They created entire mobile harbors, the Mulberry Harbors, modularly engineered floating structures that allowed hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies to be landed on beaches without infrastructure. This operation, called Overlord Logistics, was the largest act of continuous transportation ever recorded. Trucks, tanks, ammunition, fuel barrels and food crossing the Atlantic as if following an invisible production line. Each Sherman tank delivered to the field was just the visible face of a much larger gear: ocean convoys protected by escorts, floating depots, radio tracking systems, internal trains with schedules synchronized to the advance of troops. The speed with which the Americans erected airports, supply lines and maintenance stations surprised even their British allies. In some regions of France, US, military engineering paved 5 kilometers of road a day and used precast concrete to speed up the process. In less than 3 weeks after landing, there were restored railroads, active branch lines, and American locomotives operating within the reconquered territory. Meanwhile, Germany, already strangled by the Allied blockade and the destruction of its railway network, struggled to supply entire divisions with enough fuel for a single day of fighting. The Tigers, so feared on paper, became irrelevant when the gasoline did not arrive. A German officer reported after the defeat at Normandy that the defensive line collapsed not for lack of courage, but for lack of trucks. American logistics were redundant. If one ship sank, another was already on its way. If a bridge was destroyed, engineers would rebuild it within 24 hours. If a convoy got stuck in the mud, bulldozers and mobile cranes cleared the way. This operational elasticity was a direct reflection of American doctrine, not to improvise under pressure, but to plan for the unpredictable. Germany still operated as a 19th-century power, dependent on central railroads, limited transportation, and fragile supplies. The United States, on the other hand, had industrialized the very concept of supply. They created the Red Ball Express system, a logistics corridor with 6,000 trucks operating 24 hours a day between Normandy's ports and the front line. At its peak, this network transported 12,000 tons of supplies per day. Each Sherman tank received ammunition, fuel, and spare parts with a regularity comparable to that of an assembly line. It was war transformed into a factory. It was victory shaped on rails, tanks, and road maps. Germany could have heavier tanks, but the US had enough fuel to feed 1,000 of them a day. And that was the true weight of the war. It was not about who shot better, but of those who recharged faster, of those who would return tomorrow. In the next chapter, we will reveal how this logistical supremacy translated into the largest armored avalanche ever seen, when 50,000 Shermans, supplied, repaired, and coordinated, pushed the Reich all the way to Berlin, while the last Tigers agonized on shattered rails and broken dreams. Why did Germany insist on the Tiger? Why, even in the face of logistical collapse, shortages of raw materials, and mounting pressure on all fronts, has Berlin continued to invest time, resources, and lives in increasingly complex tanks? The answer lies less on the battlefield and more in the realm of ideas, or perhaps illusions. The Third Reich cultivated an aristocratic doctrine of war, the idea that extreme quality would trump any quantity. For Hitler and part of the High Command, the Tiger was not just a weapon, it was a symbol a mechanical embodiment of German racial and technological superiority. It was necessary to be invincible, even if it was impractical. Defeat could not come from numbers, only from betrayal or cowardice. This thought took deep root. Even when engineers warned of the increasing costs and complexities of the Tiger II, an even heavier and less reliable version than the original, the order went ahead. The priority was not to produce enough tanks to win battles, but to build monsters that represented the greatness of the Reich. In 1944, when the United States had already surpassed 30,000 units of Sherman produced, Germany began testing the Maus, a 188-ton tank, slow, impractical and impossible to transport over any ordinary bridge. Only 2 prototypes were completed. None entered combat, but resources were allocated: engineers, steel, fuel, time. All invested in a colossus that would never see the battlefield. It was the doctrine of suicidal grandiosity, and the numbers don't lie. For every Tiger produced, the United States manufactured 36 Shermans. For each Panther, 20. If this data surprises you, comment below, "Logistics wins." Because, while Germany designed the perfect machine, the Allies delivered enough machine. And that was decisive. The doctrinal error was not only in engineering but in philosophy. Germany designed its tanks as if each one were a medieval knight, destined to fight alone, with honor, strength, and precision. The United States, on the other hand, treated its tanks as pieces of mechanized infantry, integrated into a larger tactical system, supported by artillery, aviation, logistics, and redundancy. The German machine needed to be perfect to work. The American one, it was enough to work, and that revealed everything. There was no room to admit error. Hitler himself, in documented meetings, rejected proposals for tank simplification, stating that the prestige of the Wehrmacht required weapons worthy of the empire they represented. It was more of an aesthetic vision than a strategic one, a cult of the symbol, the aura, the theatricality of power. Meanwhile, the Americans built tanks like riding tractors, easy to operate, simple to repair, cheap to replace. The prestige was not in the machine, but in the continuity. Germany's obsession with perfection spawned other dysfunctional designs. The Jagdtiger, for example, an assault weapon with the largest cannon ever installed on an armored vehicle, but which broke the gearbox on moderate climbs. Or the Elephant, which suffered more casualties from mechanical failures than from enemy fire. They all had something in common. They impressed on paper, and they failed in practice. It was the reflection of an empire that preferred to appear invincible rather than adapt to reality. A Waffen-SS officer, interrogated after the war, coolly summed it up. "We were not defeated by the enemy. We were defeated by mathematics." In the next chapter, we will see how this mathematics turned into an avalanche when American doctrine combining volume, flexibility, and interoperability began to advance like an unstoppable gear, dissolving German symbols as if traversing forgotten ruins. Because war, in the end, does not forgive those who choose illusion. The Tiger is designed for the ideal battlefield: wide terrain, full visibility, intact supply lines, and predictable enemies. But real war does not obey manuals. It takes place in dense jungles, muddy hills, scorching deserts, and villages with narrow roads. And under these conditions, what mattered was not the most powerful tank, but the most available, the lightest, the most adaptable. The M4 Sherman became just that. Its versatility was not a bonus, it was his essence. In North Africa, the Shermans crisscrossed miles of desert, braving sand that destroyed engines and required reinforced filters. They were modified with special conveyors, adaptations in the cooling system, and extra hatches for ventilation. In Italy, they climbed mountains, crossed makeshift bridges, acted as mobile artillery, and in many cases were hoisted by cranes into defensive positions. No other tank of the war was used in such a varied way, and when the theater of operations shifted to the Pacific, the Americans transformed it again. The Sherman gained flames, additional mine armor, and amphibious versions such as the DD, duplex drive, which literally floated and could be launched into the sea. The same tank that crossed the El Alamein Desert was now surfing waves towards the beaches of Iwo Jima. It was more than a machine. It was a concept, a platform. Each battlefront generated a new variation, and each variation was absorbed without starting the project again. The internal structure allowed for quick modifications. A model with flamethrowers required few changes. A model with a crane, ditto. If the enemy dug bunkers, the Sherman turned into battering ram. If he used trenches, he became a launcher. Simplicity allowed for creativity. Meanwhile, the Tiger was a victim of its own weight, literally. At 57 tons, it was limited to main roads, did not cross light bridges, and often sank into unstable terrain. His turret needed auxiliary motors to rotate. Its tires were not easily replaceable, and its fuel consumption made it dependent on trucks that often did not arrive. The war required adaptation, and Sherman delivered. When it operated alongside infantry, its low, maneuverable shape made it a kind of mobile shield. When it operated with artillery, it was transformed into a self-propelled cannon. In the Pacific, it gained shields against Japanese grenades. In Europe, blades to open paths in hedges. There was no border that could stop him. The Tiger, even with all its firepower, was immobile without the ideal war. The Sherman, even inferior in direct combat, was always present, and this factor weighed more. By 1943, while Germany was still trying to adapt the Tiger to Soviet fields, the US was already operating Shermans on 5 continents. On average, Sherman's production spawned a new tank every 27 minutes. The doctrine of versatility worked, and it made it clear that to win a global war, a global tank was needed. It is not just about combat. It is about presence, of functionality, of persistence. War does not reward the most impressive machine. It rewards the machine that keeps running when everything around it falls apart. And at that point, the Sherman was unbeatable. In the next chapter, we will reveal how American material supremacy reached its peak, and how, at the end of the war, Germany discovered that tanks were only the beginning of a much larger gear, that of a country that had converted its entire industry to a single mission: to win. Behind every Sherman tank that appeared on the battlefield, there was another army. An army that didn't use rifles, didn't march in formation, didn't show up in propaganda photos. It was an army of factory workers, engineers, welders, women in tight bandanas, migrants who left plantations, veterans who came back to teach, young people who learned to assemble parts before they could even drive. America's industrial miracle didn't happen quietly. It echoed in the hammers of Detroit, the cranes of Pennsylvania, the assembly lines of Ford that in just one shift produced more armored vehicles than some nations in a month. The production line was the new battlefront. With each new offensive at the front, the effort intensified in the factories. If the infantry advanced, more tanks were required. If winter approached, thermal adaptations were implemented within weeks. It was a constant dialogue between the field and the factory floor. When American engineers realized that the Tiger had advantages in armor and firing range, they didn't rush to build something equivalent. They rushed to produce it faster, cheaper, lighter. The answer was not to double power. It was a 5-fold presence, and this was only possible because there was a collective culture of production oriented towards victory. Women like Rosie, the riveter, became icons because they represented something new. War fought with civilian competence. Nearly 6 million women passed through the arms industries between 1941 and 1945. They made engines, tested tanks, painted fuselages. They operated with the precision of a watchmaker, and they knew that every misplaced piece could cost lives on the other side of the ocean. The consciousness of war was total. Each rivet, each screw, each liter of paint had a destination. There was honor in working efficiently. At the docks, dockers organized barrels of fuel with the same discipline as generals on campaign. At universities, engineers were designing modular systems that would allow field mechanics to swap out Sherman parts in a matter of hours, even under bombardment. When it came to all-out war, the US wasn't just arming soldiers, it was arming an entire country to resist. The average age of the assembly line workers was 34 years old. Many would never see the front, but his children fought in it, and their tanks crossed the Rhine. The engineers were also soldiers. They just used clipboards instead of rifles. One of them, Harold T. White, created the suspension system that allowed the Sherman to operate stably in mountainous terrain. Others tested armor by replacing steel with lighter composites without compromising integrity. The goal was clear: to win with enough, not with the ideal. And if something broke on the field, the mechanics knew what to do. They did not expect orders. They knew they could disassemble an engine, find a damaged component, and improvise with parts from another tank. This autonomy was trained from the beginning. The doctrine was not only military, it was mental, it was cultural. Each worker knew that his shift was part of a larger movement, that his effort would have an echo in Europe. One piece of data illustrates the size of this gear. Every hour, the United States produced about 4 tanks, 12 planes, 24 trucks, 1 transport ship, and 500,000 rounds of ammunition. It was a cadence impossible to follow, a silent roar that came from the factories. One German officer interrogated after the war stated, "We don't just fight against American soldiers. We fight against every factory, every rail, every civilian workforce in that country." If this impresses you, comment below, absolute power, because that is exactly what defines this effort, a fully mobilized society. In the next chapter, we will see the practical impact of this effort, when Germany's roads began to fill up with Shermans from all sides, and the only German response was no longer technical or tactical. It was desperation. In 1945, with the Reich collapsing and the ruins of Berlin swallowing the last shreds of resistance, many captured German officers began to speak out, not haughtily, but with a bitter mixture of respect and surprise. Between interrogations, reports, and memories recorded after the war, a pattern emerged. German admiration was not directed at the firepower of the Allies, nor at the courage of the soldiers, but at the invisible cog that moved it all. It was the system, the US. Ability to weaponize organization. They didn't beat us in battle. They won in planning, General Alfred Jodl would say, days before signing the surrender. Others pointed to something even more technical. The US ability to move entire divisions with guaranteed fuel, accurate feeding, constant maintenance, standardized ammunition, and continuous replacements. This was incomprehensible to a Wehrmacht accustomed to improvising, to patching tanks with parts of different models, to relying on vulnerable trains and a logistics chain constantly on the verge of collapse. One panzer commander wrote, "If we lost 3 tanks, it was a crisis. If they lost 30, it was a report." Respect for Sherman was not in the cannon. It was in the cycle. In the time it took between losing a tank and seeing another in its place. It was a doctrine of resilience. Many German officers who fought in Africa noticed this for the first time. The Americans were losing equipment, but never the rhythm. They were moving forward as if they had invisible rails underfoot, said Erwin Rommel, who admitted that the biggest threat was not the force, but the flow. This perception was even clearer on the Western Front. When the Germans destroyed one train, another appeared days later. When one offensive seemed to be interrupted, another began on the opposite flank. There was no break, there was no shortage, Albert Speer himself, Nazi Minister of Armaments, acknowledged, "We underestimated the American ability to coordinate production, transport and combat as a single continuous operation." To Germans, accustomed to thinking of individual genius, whether in the form of a tank, a commander, or a surprise offensive, American war seemed impersonal. But that was exactly what made her unbeatable. It didn't depend on a name, a hero, or a tank. It was a project. And that's why it was constant. "They fought with spreadsheets, not instinct," said one Luftwaffe officer when asked about the air defeat. In fact, the same reasoning applied to soil. Each American offensive was preceded by convoys, logistical maps, loss analyses, and replacement capacity. Nothing was done on the fly. And the irony of this story is that the solution to the war was not in any military secret. It was in plain sight. It was enough to look at the numbers. If you are enjoying unraveling these facts in depth, enjoy the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps keep the real story alive, the one told with data, not myths. Because while Germany was still looking for a decisive weapon, the US had already decided that no weapon was enough, but that a cohesive, flexible and continuous structure could bend any obstacle. The German admiration in the end was an admission. They hadn't lost to a tank. They had lost to an idea. In the next chapter, we will reveal how this idea spread to the front lines, and how Germany itself tried, too late, to copy what it had ignored from the beginning. There were times when the Tiger seemed to justify every bolt of its monumental build. At Villers-Bocage, June 1944, a single Tiger under the command of Michael Wittmann ambushed and destroyed dozens of British vehicles in a matter of minutes. It was a lesson in precision, aggressiveness, and technical mastery. The world watched, bewildered, the isolated feat of a tank that seemed to defy the logic of modern warfare. At Kursk, the largest armored engagement in history, the Tiger also shone. Its frontal armor withstanding direct hits, its 88mm gun destroying targets before enemies even spotted them. They were moments of glory, but also of illusion, because while a Tiger destroyed 20 vehicles in one day, American factories produced 40 more that same morning. The math did not stop. Wittmann was killed weeks later, his tank destroyed by an ambush by coordinated Shermans. And Kursk, despite fierce resistance, ended up with irrecoverable losses for the Germans, while the Soviets, supplied by trains coming from the United States with fuel, ammunition and Shermans, kept the offensive. The Tiger, with all its grandeur, was a spark. The Sherman, a continuous storm. War is not decided by heroic deeds. It is decided by constancy, by rhythm, by presence. In Mortain, in Falaise, in Bastogne, the Shermans did not shine individually, but they were always there. While the Tiger required specific fuel, custom parts, and favorable soil, the Sherman traversed rivers with floats, climbed hills with improvised traction, stormed cities with infantry support. It didn't win by impact, he won by continuity. In each theater of operations, the American doctrine was the same: saturate, advance, hold, and with that, collapse the opponent by time, not by genius. The Tiger's one-off victories became legends, but legends don't change maps. Presence changes. And the maps of Europe, North Africa and the Pacific were redrawn by Sherman's columns, moving with frightening regularity. The American soldier trusted the tank, not because it was the best, but because it was there, because if it broke, another one would come. Because behind it there were parts, gasoline, food, radios, maps, and a logistics chain that didn't sleep. While the Tiger was a monument to technical superiority, the Sherman was a testament to strategic intelligence. When Germany was trying to create the next supertanker, the United States had already created the next ship to transport it, the next train to fuel it, the next playbook to train it. Victory was built as an assembly line, piece by piece, soldier by soldier, tank by tank. Tiger won duels. The Sherman won the war. and that distinction marks the line between brilliance and victory. In the next chapter, we will reveal how the Germans, realizing this, tried to copy this doctrine too late, and how, even after defeat, the lesson would continue to echo in the wars to come. The end of the war was not just the fall of a regime, it was the fall of an idea crystallized in the form of a steel colossus, designed to be invincible but unable to multiply. The Tiger wasn't just a tank, it was a statue, admired, feared, revered, but immovable. It represented the cult of the exceptional, of the masterpiece that despises the common, of the illusion that absolute quality can replace presence. The Sherman, on the other hand, was the opposite of this philosophy. It was possible. The produced, the envoy, the repaired, the repeated. He represented another world view, that a good idea, when replicated with discipline, trumps a lone genius. The war was the stage for this silent clash. On the one hand, the adoration for the singular. On the other, faith in the functional. The Tiger promised glory. Sherman delivered results. One was the warrior of legend, the other the soldier who returned to combat before the engine cooled down. American superiority was not just industrial, it was philosophical. It was the victory of adaptability over pride, from organization over improvisation, from moral engineering over tactical vanity. When the last Tiger was silenced, what collapsed was not just a machine, it was the belief that genius alone can sustain an empire. Germany bet on the symbol, the United States in the system, and systems win wars. Was the tank win? No. It was the idea that allowed thousands of them to exist. The Sherman has never been the best tank in the field, but it was the tank that was always on the field. And this constant fluid presence, like a river that advances in spite of the stones, has become unstoppable, because rivers don't need to win in the first clash, they just keep going, and that's enough. In the next chapter, we'll explore how this philosophy shaped not only the end of World War II, but also the conflicts and military doctrines of the next century, and why, to this day, the lesson of the Tiger and Sherman continues to be taught in military academies around the world. For decades, the world has looked at the Tiger with the eyes of admiration. His design still inhabits engineering books. His achievements are reconstructed in games, films, and documentaries. It has survived in memory as a war sculpture, a monument to what the human mind is capable of building when it pursues boundless technical perfection. But the story, when told unadorned, reveals a silent paradox. The Tiger represented what we most desired: uniqueness, excellence, invincibility. And yet, it was won over by what we value least: the common, the repeatable, the enough. In times of war, and also in times of peace, how often do we choose the brilliant idea over the feasible action? How many times do we admire what shines, but despise what it delivers? The Tiger is what we would like to be. Sherman is what we need to be. A tank is only immortal if it returns to combat. An idea is only victorious if it can be applied. The American triumph was not one of strength. It was one of strategic humility, accepting that perfection is not the way, persistence is. In every Detroit plant, in every train crossing the continent, in every engine rebuilt in the field, there was a message. True superiority lies in keeping running when everything comes crashing down. Germany built tanks as if they were jewels. The United States built as if planting, and he reaped it. This lesson goes beyond war. In any crisis, in any battle of life, we have a choice: pursue the impossible ideal or build enough to overcome the real. It is not monuments that change the course of history. They are silent, repeated, resistant solutions. And when the dust settles, they are the ones who are still standing. In the final chapter, we will reveal how this logic shaped not only war, but the 20th century itself, and how the Sherman's invisible legacy still moves the armies, economies, and moral choices of our time. When the dust settled on the ruins of Europe, it wasn't the most powerful tanks that stayed on the move. They were the most constant. Germany, surrendered and split in half, saw the collapse not only of its army, but of its belief. The doctrine of technical invincibility, of isolated genius, of the supreme machine, collapsed in the face of mathematics applied with discipline. The Tiger, with all its grandeur, ended up as a symbol of the most fatal strategic mistake. Betting on the rare when what is required is the replicable. In the end, it wasn't the caliber of a cannon that won the war. It was the cadence of an engine that never stopped being manufactured. The real strength was in the rails that carried fuel, in the cranes that moved supplies, in the millions of screws that tightened the logic of a victory built with pragmatism. The great lesson of this war is not about tanks. It's about vision, about understanding that in prolonged battles, genius without scale is just vanity, but collective, organized, functional effort, that changes the world. As General Alfred Jodl confessed after the surrender, we were not defeated by enemy talent. We were defeated by his trucks. If you believe in the importance of keeping the memory of the facts alive, enjoy this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. It helps us continue to unearth the truths that have shaped the century. And write in the comments, what was the most shocking data for you? Was it the production of the 49,000 Shermans, the time to ride a tiger, or the testimony of those who fought within them? Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story, because in the end, the war was won by those who knew how to count, and he told until the end.